Imagine living in a world where justice wasn't blind, it was insane. Where rulers punished lies with molten metal, thieves with scorpions, and curiosity with pain so creative it became legend. Across centuries and continents, humans have invented punishments so bizarre they blur the line between justice and madness. From execution methods designed to make death an art form, to torture rituals disguised as law, tonight we're diving into the darkest corners of human cruelty. These aren't myths, these were real, and they were enforced. In ancient Persia, traitors met the horror of scaphism. Stripped naked, trapped between boats, force-fed milk and honey until their bodies overflowed, then left afloat on a stagnant pond. Flies, worms, and decay consumed them alive for days. The Persians believed this slow digestion by nature purified the empire of deceit. A punishment so methodical it blurred death and digestion, justice literally eating its own enemies, one writhing scream at a time. In medieval England, the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, turned execution into theater. Criminals were tied to spokes as iron hammers shattered every bone, one limb at a time. The crowd watched as bodies twisted into shapes no artist could imagine. Sometimes mercy came hours later, sometimes days. The church blessed it as divine justice. Europe called it deterrence. But the truth was simpler. It was entertainment wrapped in righteousness, pain paraded as morality. Ancient China perfected terror through Ling Qi, the death of 1,000 cuts. Flesh was sliced piece by piece while the victim stayed conscious, sometimes drugged with opium to prolong awareness. This wasn't execution, it was humiliation eternal. Families of the condemned were often forced to watch, learning obedience through trauma. Banned in 1905, Ling Qi still stands as one of humanity's most meticulous performances of cruelty, where the goal wasn't death. It was memory carved into history. In Renaissance Italy, the iron chair awaited political dissenters. A spiked throne, heated red-hot, it made royalty's symbol of power a literal furnace of agony. Victims were strapped naked, their flesh sizzling, skin merging with iron. Screams echoed through Florence's dungeons like twisted hymns. It was theater of obedience. Sit in the seat of kings, and you'd burn for the audacity. The irony was perfect. Power punished imitation by turning its own symbols into instruments of pain. In ancient Rome, the poenaculae punished parricides, those who killed their parents, with surreal cruelty. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a snake, a rooster, and a monkey, then thrown into a river. Each animal represented chaos, vengeance, and madness. The Romans believed even nature should reject such killers. Inside the sack, claws and fangs tore flesh as water filled lungs. A family crime answered by a family of beasts. Medieval Germany practiced the rat torture. A metal cage containing live rats was strapped to the victim's abdomen. Heated from behind, the panicked rats burrowed through living flesh to escape. It wasn't just pain, it was horror that made imagination an accomplice. Invented during the 30 Years' War, it symbolized chaos devouring humanity. The screams were said to echo long after death, as if the body remembered being eaten from within. In ancient Greece, the brazen bull of Phalaris turned execution into music. Victims were locked inside a hollow bronze bull and roasted alive as fire burned beneath. Pipes in the mouth transformed screams into bellowing roars, an orchestra of agony. Legend says Phalaris, the tyrant who commissioned it, was later roasted inside his own invention. Justice poetic and scorching, turning cruelty back on its creator. The bull never stopped roaring, its echoes haunted Greece for centuries. In 16th century France, the saw torture punished blasphemers and adulterers. The condemned were hung upside down and sawn slowly from the groin downward, gravity ensuring consciousness until the final breath. Blood drained perfectly, prolonging agony. The church called it purification through suffering. Villagers called it divine entertainment. Humanity called it justice. Every stroke of the saw cut not just flesh, but faith, morality, and the illusion that civilization ever softened human hands. Imperial Japan enforced the bamboo torture. Prisoners were tied above young bamboo shoots, whose growth rate could pierce through the human body in days. Nature itself became the executioner. As shoots grew, they impaled flesh, splitting organs silently. The Japanese samurai courts saw it as poetic balance, death by life. It was the most patient form of punishment ever devised, letting the earth slowly reclaim the living 1 inch at a time. In medieval Russia, the knout was both whip and weapon of politics. Crafted from hardened leather, sometimes with metal tips, it could tear flesh to bone in a single strike. Sentences varied from 20 lashes to until death. Some victims were paraded half alive through icy streets, frozen blood gluing rags to their backs. The czars called it justice. The peasants called it spectacle. History remembers it as punishment that left scars deeper than rebellion itself. In 15th century England, hanged, drawn, and quartered was the crown's ultimate statement of treason. The condemned were dragged through streets, hanged until half dead, disemboweled while conscious, their entrails burned before their eyes, then limbs severed and nailed across the kingdom. It wasn't execution. It was a national broadcast of obedience through terror. Crowds cheered as law turned men into anatomy lessons. The king's mercy was sometimes to let the heart stop before the knife reached it. In ancient India, elephant execution merged spectacle with spirituality. Condemned prisoners were crushed or tossed by war elephants trained to obey royal gestures. Sometimes elephants slowly pressed down, first limbs, then skulls, to entertain courtiers. The Mughal emperors believed divine beasts carried divine justice. Trumpets, drums, and incense turned death into ritual. The ground shook, bones cracked like thunder, and the crowd chanted as if witnessing karma's physical form, the animal as both executioner and priest. In 17th century Holland, the wooden horse punished soldiers and adulterers. Victims were forced to sit astride a sharp wooden beam, often with heavy weights tied to their feet, splitting their groins slowly. It was humiliation disguised as discipline, done publicly, sometimes during festivals. Women watched, children learned. Pain became pedagogy. The Dutch called it riding the horse of honor. Ironically, it produced no honor, only blood, broken flesh, and the echo of laughter over shame. In medieval China, death by boiling was reserved for traitors and poisoners. Victims were submerged in cauldrons of oil or water, heated from below. Records describe skin bubbling, eyes bursting, flesh detaching like silk ribbons. Sometimes officials tasted the liquid afterward to prove justice was complete. Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang ordered hundreds boiled alive in one day. It was purity through fire, the empire sterilizing itself with human broth, a grotesque alchemy of law and heat. In ancient Assyria, rebels faced flaying alive. Their skin was peeled in long ribbons, then nailed to city walls as warning banners. Scribes recorded the screams, and relief carvings immortalized the scene. The Assyrian kings saw cruelty as architecture. Pain turned into monuments. Victims didn't just die, they became messages in flesh, carved into stone for eternity. Their cities burned, their skin fluttered like parchment, their suffering preserved as the first written propaganda of terror. In Tudor England, the scold's bridle silenced outspoken women. A metal mask with spikes pressed against the tongue locked around the head, forcing public humiliation through agony. Wives, midwives, or critics were paraded through town, mocked by crowds. The pain wasn't the point, the silence was. Patriarchy engineered it as obedience through mutilation. Every drop of blood from bitten tongues was a warning. Speak truth, and your words will shred your own flesh. In 18th century France, the breaking on the wheel became a carnival. Criminals were tied to a cartwheel. Executioners crushed bones with iron bars in ritual sequence. The body was woven between spokes and left to rot in the open square. Sometimes birds nested in rib cages. The church prayed while spectators drank wine. Justice became choreography, a slow ballet of bones and sin. France's Enlightenment couldn't yet light the darkness beneath its own gallows. In ancient Egypt, the desert burial punished traitors to Pharaoh. Victims were buried chest deep in the burning sand, their heads smeared with honey to attract insects. The sun itself became executioner. Locusts crawled into mouths, ants nested in nostrils. Priests claimed Ra watched the purification. Impurity burned from the soul by the desert's gaze. Death took hours. Civilization's cradle proved it could still worship pain like a god wearing golden dust. In 16th century Spain, the Spanish donkey punished heretics during the Inquisition. The victim straddled a sharp wooden wedge, weights tied to legs to deepen the split. Blood flowed like confession. Priests called it cleansing through division, the body separating sin from soul. Sometimes they prayed beside the screaming. Ironically, those who preached salvation inflicted damnation 1 inch at a time. Spain's faith turned carpentry into anatomy. Religion became a tool sharper than the blade itself. In ancient Mongolia, carpet suffocation was used to kill nobles without spilling royal blood. The condemned were wrapped in thick rugs and trampled by horses or crushed under soldiers. No wound, no blood, only silence. Genghis Khan used it for princes who betrayed him. To the Mongols, it preserved purity. No warrior sword defiled the body. Death came quietly, respect intact, lungs collapsing under honor. It was execution disguised as mercy, clean, swift, suffocatingly dignified. In 16th century Ottoman Turkey, the sack execution punished royal disobedience with elegance. Princes or concubines were tied inside silk sacks and tossed into the Bosphorus at night. No blood, no noise, just ripples in moonlight. The empire called it the silent sentence. Eunuchs carried it out swiftly, ensuring purity of royal hands. The idea was simple. Honor must kill discreetly. Empires built on ceremony couldn't tolerate messy death, so they perfected drowning in velvet silence. In medieval Scotland, the maiden predated the guillotine. A sharp blade slid down between wooden guides, severing heads cleanly. But it wasn't about mercy, it was display. The condemned kneeled before crowds, eyes locked with justice itself. Nobles and thieves alike met the same polished blade. The Scots called it innovation. It was the industrialization of decapitation, efficiency dressed as fairness. History later copied it in France, proving progress can still drip blood with precision. In ancient Persia's Tower of Silence, corpses weren't buried. They were fed to vultures. But for criminals, being denied that ritual was the punishment. Their bodies were hidden, left to rot unseen, spirit trapped, denied ascension. Zoroastrians believed exposure purified the soul, so, withholding it, condemned the ghost eternally. It wasn't torture of flesh, it was torture of fate. To be forgotten, unseen, unconsumed, was a second death crueler than the first, oblivion as punishment. In 18th century China, slow slicing under glass domes was a rumored refinement of Ling Qi. Wealthy officials paid to watch condemned men flayed within transparent cases to study the art of endurance. Perfumes masked decay, musicians played to the rhythm of screams. It was suffering turned aesthetic. The elite didn't just crave justice, they collected agony like art. Pain became performance, and execution became entertainment for those who mistook cruelty for culture. Civilization's luxury turned barbaric. In ancient Sparta, Cryptia punished disobedient helots, state slaves, by death through sport. Spartan youths hunted them at night, killing silently to prove manhood. It was government-sponsored murder disguised as ritual. The helots were forced to live in fear of footsteps in the dark, every sound possibly their end. Sparta called it training. The world later called it genocide rehearsed. Discipline and cruelty became indistinguishable in a land that worshipped strength above justice. In medieval Italy, the pair of anguish silenced blasphemers and women accused of witchcraft. A metal device inserted into the mouth or elsewhere, expanded by a screw, tearing tissue internally. No blood, no visible wound, just internal ruin. The church favored it because it left no marks on the soul's vessel. It was the mechanical whisper of purity, sanctified in steel. Victims died with their bodies intact but their insides shattered, a quiet sermon in iron. In 13th century France, the blood eagle was whispered of as Norse horror reborn. Victims' ribs were split from the spine, lungs pulled outward to resemble wings, salt rubbed in to keep them conscious. Whether myth or memory, it terrified Europe for centuries. Vikings believed it sent warriors to Odin, cleansed of cowardice. It wasn't punishment, it was purification by spectacle. The sky filled with cries mistaken for flight, and God smiled upon mutilation. In ancient Rome, crucifixion was the empire's psychological weapon. Victims were nailed to wooden crosses, left to suffocate slowly under their own weight. It was cheap, public, and humiliating, reserved for slaves and rebels. Death took hours, sometimes days. The message was clear. Rome ruled not by mercy but by fear. Ironically, the symbol of its cruelty became one of redemption centuries later. Pain immortalized, empire turned religion through the geometry of suffering. In 17th century Russia, the stake impalement became Tsar Ivan's favorite warning. Victims were mounted alive on sharpened poles that pierced from rectum to shoulder, missing vital organs to prolong agony. Some lived for hours, even days, while birds fed on their faces. Crowds gathered not in horror but fascination. The Tsar called it flowering justice, each victim a garden of loyalty grown in fear. History still trembles at his harvest of screams. In 19th century Siam, the crushing of elephants survived as royal entertainment. Condemned rebels lay before trained elephants that slowly pressed down until ribs shattered. Sometimes the mahout lifted the foot, paused, and pressed again, to please the crowd. It wasn't just execution, it was choreography. Kings watched calmly from gilded balconies. The empire claimed elephants carried divine judgment, but everyone knew the truth. It was theater, where death bowed before monarchy's applause. In 17th century England, pressing to death or peine forte et dure crushed those who refused to plead in court. The accused was laid flat, heavy stones piled slowly upon the chest until ribs caved and breath collapsed. Some endured for days, bones cracking one confession at a time. The law called it necessity, forcing a plea from silence, but it was really a ritual of dominance, the state proving it could make even silence scream before dying. In ancient Korea, the tiger pit punished traitors and spies. Victims were thrown into deep pits where starving tigers were kept without food for days. The animals tore them apart within seconds, bones snapping like twigs in the royal gardens. The spectacle wasn't just death. It was performance of power. The king's court gathered to watch fury feed. The message was primal. Betrayal feeds beasts, and the throne always watches its own justice devour flesh. In 16th century Hungary, Countess Elizabeth Bathory earned infamy for the bloodbath rituals. Accused of torturing and killing hundreds of maidens, she allegedly bathed in their blood to preserve youth. Servants were burned, frozen, and mutilated as aristocratic curiosity became obsession. Her castle turned into a private morgue of vanity. Historians debate the details, but one truth endures. When power lacks morality, cruelty becomes skincare. The Countess became legend not for age, but for rot disguised as beauty. In ancient Japan, seppuku was suicide by honor. Samurai disemboweled themselves with short blades, cutting horizontally, sometimes vertically, while a second executed the beheading. It wasn't punishment from others, but from oneself. The ritual purified shame through agony. Blood was seen as redemption, pain as proof of loyalty. Witnesses watched in silence as intestines spilled like truth on tatami mats. Dying gracefully meant controlling even suffering, a death so composed it felt almost sacred in its horror. In 14th century India, sati demanded widows burn alive on their husbands' funeral pyres. Considered devotion's ultimate act, it turned love into cremation. Women were drugged, tied, or convinced by priests that refusal doomed both souls. The air filled with chants as bodies ignited together, faith consuming flesh. The British outlawed it in 1829, calling it barbaric. But for centuries, fire had been marriage's final vow, a cruel symphony where devotion ended in ash and applause. In medieval England, the dunking stool punished accused witches and adulterers. Bound to a wooden chair, victims were repeatedly plunged into freezing rivers. If they drowned, they were innocent. If they survived, they were executed. It was logic turned insanity. Villagers gathered cheering as justice bubbled with breathless screams. Women's strength was their guilt, their frailty, their proof. The stool creaked, the water closed, and superstition became the judge that never lost a trial. In ancient Rome, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, fed criminals to lions, tigers, or bears before roaring crowds. The Colosseum turned death into festival. Merchants sold bread. Poets recited verses as bodies were torn apart. Rome called it spectacle. History called it savagery wrapped in marble. The emperor's thumb decided fate, and mercy was rarer than survival. Civilization applauded as man became meat, and empire disguised its appetite as entertainment. In 18th century England, the gibbet preserved corpses as warnings. Executed criminals were hung in iron cages, displayed for months or years along roads. Crows nested in skulls, rain hollowed bone. The stench guided travelers long before they saw the body. It was death's billboard, advertising obedience through decay. Justice didn't end at execution. It lingered, swaying with the wind, reminding the living that even after death, the law still claimed your flesh. In ancient China, the red-hot iron kiss punished infidelity. A heated metal statue, often of a woman, was placed before the condemned, who was forced to embrace it. Skin fused to iron, lungs burned from steam rising off their own body. Officials claimed it symbolized passion's consequence, lust punished by its mirror. Crowds watched as desire turned to death. It wasn't law, it was theater. A bronze morality play performed in screams instead of dialogue. In 17th century Russia, the ice pillar execution froze enemies of the Tsar. Prisoners were stripped, doused in water, and bound to wooden poles in the Siberian cold. Layer by layer, ice consumed their bodies until they became statues of rebellion. Some lived long enough to see their own frozen reflection glimmer in moonlight. It was silence sculpted in suffering. The empire's way of saying resistance doesn't burn, it freezes. Even mercy froze mid-air. In 17th century England, the brazen maiden's kiss was a variant of the Iron Maiden. Victims were enclosed in a standing sarcophagus lined with inward spikes, shaped like a serene woman's face. When the doors closed, the spikes pierced organs without killing instantly. Blood dripped slowly through hidden holes. The church called it the merciful embrace. To die inside a sculpture of beauty was irony so grotesque it became art, devotion forged into steel, tenderness turned into torture. In ancient Egypt, crocodile feeding was punishment for temple theft. The condemned were thrown into sacred pools of the Nile, where crocodiles, believed to be manifestations of Sobek, devoured them alive. Priests called it divine restoration, sins returned to the gods through flesh. The screams echoed between stone columns, while incense burned above the bloodied water. Egypt didn't hide cruelty, it ritualized it, turning death into sacred meal and punishment into the worship of hunger. In 16th century Germany, the iron spider punished adulterers and traitors. The victims' limbs were chained to iron hooks, and horses pulled in opposite directions until the body split apart. Sometimes the parts were displayed on city gates as moral lessons. The church claimed it purified sin through dismemberment. Citizens called it the spider's blessing. Pain was order, the state was God, and every torn limb was a prayer written in tendon and terror. In ancient Tibet, sky burial for the condemned twisted a holy ritual into punishment. Criminals were dismembered and left for vultures, but unlike the sacred dead, their bones were mixed with dung, denying reincarnation. The monks believed impurity should feed impurity. The condemned vanished not into eternity, but into digestion. Tibet turned compassion into hierarchy, showing even the afterlife could discriminate. The sky opened, but not for everyone. Some souls, it seemed, were eaten before forgiven. In 18th century France, the iron cage suspension punished thieves and deserters. The condemned was locked inside a metal cage hung high from gallows, left to starve as crows picked eyes and flesh. Below, villagers passed daily, throwing stones or prayers. Death came over days, then weeks, as skeletons swung like wind chimes of justice. The cage was both coffin and billboard, France's reminder that the body could rot publicly while the law stayed clean. In 16th century Japan, oil-dripping torture targeted spies and criminals. Victims were tied upside down while hot oil dripped slowly on bare skin, forehead, eyelids, chest. It wasn't the burns that killed, but anticipation between drops. Samurai called it the discipline of patience. Some survived days, their sanity melting before flesh. Japan's artistry extended even to pain, precision, rhythm, control. Torture became ceremony where time itself was the weapon, drop by drop, thought by thought. In medieval Italy, buried head first was punishment for blasphemy. Offenders were buried upside down, legs twitching in the air as dirt filled lungs. Priests said it inverted the soul, sending it downward to hell before death. Crowds gathered to watch feet slowly still. It was theology by suffocation, turning gravity into divine justice. The church preached salvation upward, yet punished by sending sinners downward, proof that even holiness can weaponize the ground beneath you. In 14th century Persia, molten gold execution awaited tax frauds and betrayers of the crown. Liquid gold was poured down the throat, burning organs from within. The symbolism was perfect, greed devoured by its own treasure. Witnesses described the scent of scorched flesh mingled with metal. The Shah's court called it poetry of justice. The empire believed gold purified as much as it corrupted, making death not just punishment, but ironic repayment in its richest form. In 18th century China, the wooden clog torture crushed bones invisibly. Victims' feet were locked in iron-bound shoes, tightened with each confession. Bones splintered, nerves burst, yet the skin often stayed intact, allowing repeated sessions. It was bureaucracy's masterpiece, cruelty leaving no visible proof. The magistrates called it silent persuasion. Pain without evidence, suffering without scars, an early glimpse into psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. China's justice system perfected invisibility long before modern courts. In 19th century Madagascar, Tangina ordeal decided guilt through poison. Accused criminals drank a deadly nut mixture and vomited after swallowing 3 chicken skins. If the skins reappeared, they were innocent. If not, they died. Thousands perished yearly, judged by digestion. Kings saw it as divine filtering, God inside the gut deciding truth. Justice became chemistry, trial became stomach. It was proof humanity trusted poison over conscience and let death do the thinking for morality.